Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the College of Arts and Humanities Colloquium series on race, equity, and justice. I'm Bonnie Thornton-Dill, Dean of the College and Professor in the newly renamed Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. This morning is the fourth in the series that is part of the college's broader initiative on race, equity, and social justice, developed around the goal of understanding and dismantling structural racism. Strategies include transforming curriculum and scholarship, reducing discrimination in teaching, research and service, expanding the impact of ARHU's long-standing and continuing research and scholarship on racism, anti-racism, equity, and justice. And consistent with President Pine's call to focus on race and identity as we welcome new members of our community, we're pleased to have students participating with us this morning as part of the new Terrapin Strong onboarding program. In the college, part of our approach to Terrapin Strong is to offer opportunities for you, students, to be exposed to the many different ways faculty and scholars in the college study and teach about these issues. In this series, I invite faculty experts from across ARHU to discuss their scholarship and creative projects related to anti-racism and social justice. And the format for each session is the same. It includes a brief presentation by our guest, followed by a conversation between the two of us, and then an opportunity for you to ask questions. So we'll ask that your microphones remain mute for this part of the program. And then during the last 20 minutes or so, you will be invited to submit questions through the chat, which is being moderated by Associate Dean Linda Aldury, who will manage the Q&A. So please note, this event is being recorded for future viewing on the college's website. So without further ado, today's session features Julius Fleming, Jr., Assistant Professor of English. Dr. Fleming's expertise is in Afro-diasporic literatures and cultures. He has particular interests in performance studies, Black political culture, diaspora, and colonialism, especially where they intersect with race, gender, and sexuality. Dr. Fleming is a rising star, and already he has received a number of important awards. In 2018, he was named the Nancy Weiss Maciel Scholar by the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, and a 2018 Emerging Scholar of the African Diaspora by the Comparative and International Education Society. His talk today centers around his forthcoming book, Black Patience, Performance and the Modern Civil Rights Movement. And it will focus on the relationship between performance and activism and how African Americans have created alternative ways of expressing ideas about freedom. So at this time, I'm really happy to introduce to you Dr. Julius Fleming. Julius.
Hey, thanks so much, Dean Thornton-Dill, for that introduction and for your leadership and hard work. Thanks to everyone at ARHU who made this happen, and to all of you for being here this morning. And can you all hear me okay? All right, cool. I also just want to start by giving a special shout out to my undergraduate mentor, Dr. Candace Love Jackson, who's on the call, because that's where so much of the kind of thinking I do in this book began as a freshman in college at Tougaloo College. So it's good to see you, Dr. Jackson. So I'll divide this short talk into 3 short sections. In the first section, I'll just offer a historical example to just sort of provide some concept of where the idea of Black patience came from for me as a thinker. And then I'll move into an overview of the book, and then I'll close just by talking off script about a few of the kinds of examples I use in the book to make the argument that I make. So during the 1950s, the US nation state faced 2 major geopolitical crises that were nothing less than struggles for dominance over time and space: the space race on the one hand, and the modern civil rights movement on the other hand. On October 4th, 1957, Against the backdrop of the razor-sharp tensions animating the Cold War, the Soviet Union shook the US nation state when it launched the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1. Startled by the technological feats of a Cold War foe, and emboldened by the hubris of a nation that envisioned itself as the superpower, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act on July 29, 1958, authorizing the birth of NASA and its hefty budget of $100 million. With this intense Cold War conflict on the rise, outer space became a new frontier in a heated scramble to expand the territory of nation and empire into geographies that were once beyond human contact, and importantly, to execute these spatial expansions at record speeds. By placing his seal of approval on this congressional act, Eisenhower not only endorsed a national program, but sanctioned a national ideology as well. In other words, he used the gravity of US presidential power to endorse the nation's deep-seated desires to move through space more quickly and more freely. But Eisenhower brought a strikingly different time-space thinking to bear on the civil rights movement, namely to Black people's similar efforts to eliminate spatial barriers and to acquire, quote, freedom now. At a July 17, 1957 press conference, Eisenhower, an otherwise committed advocate of eliminating spatial and temporal barriers, laments, quote, "I personally believe if you try to go too far, too fast in laws in this delicate field that has involved the emotions of so many millions of Americans, you're making a mistake." Therefore, as civil rights activists were working to eradicate the temporal and spatial barriers imposed by anti-Blackness and white supremacy, Eisenhower was fighting to pump the brakes on the pace of these spatio-temporal ambitions, and thereby to cordon off Black people from the national project of revolutionizing time and space in this post-war era of socio-political and technological transformation. Eisenhower's trenchant demands for Black people to wait or to be patient were routinely headlined in newspapers across the nation. The titles of some of these columns include, for example, quote, "Eisenhower bids Negroes be patient about rights." Another, "President asks Negro patience." And a third, "President urges patience in crisis." In a May 12, 1958 address to an audience of Black media, community, and business leaders, the president reiterated these calls for, quote, "patience and forbearance." Asked for his reaction to Eisenhower's request, William O. Walker, then president of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, an umbrella organization for Black newspapers, noted, quote, that this kind of advice we, Black people, have been getting since the 1954 school integration decision of the Supreme Court. Invoking the court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education to integrate public schools with, quote, "all deliberate speed," Walker goes on to add, quote, "Today, Negroes were asking the question, how long is deliberate speed?" Also in the room for Eisenhower's address, and no less peeved, was civil rights activist and baseball legend Jackie Robinson, the first African-American to play in Major League Baseball. Taking issue with Eisenhower's demand for Black patience, Robinson wrote a letter to the president the following day. "I was sitting in the audience at the summit meeting of Negro leaders yesterday when you said we must have patience. On hearing you say this, I felt like standing up and saying, 'Oh no, not again.' I respectfully remind you, sir, that we have been the most patient of all people. When you said we must have self-respect, I wondered how we could have self-respect and remain patient, considering the treatment accorded us through the years. 17 million Negroes cannot do as you suggest and wait for the hearts of men to change. We want to enjoy now the rights that we feel we are entitled to as Americans." During this era, the nation's watershed innovations in space technology were matched by advancements in financial systems that sped up the turnover time of capital, by newly built interstates that reduced the time required to travel from one place to another, by television news cycles that modernized the international flow of information across time and space. In a word, this historical moment was deeply invested in reducing the time required for matter to move through space. And yet, as Eisenhower's remarks suggest, there existed a concomitant effort to reduce the speed at which Black people would acquire freedom and full citizenship, and a hard-fought battle to preserve the barriers of racial spatial segregation. In other words, the intensification of time-space compression ushered in by this iconic phase of technological modernity stood in contradistinction to the racialized logics of spatial constriction, slowness, and stasis that inflected Black people's political realities. Such glaring contradictions between national ideals of speed and slowness, stillness and movement underlie a formative aporia or structural tension at the heart of global modernity. That is the twin attachment to the quick time of modern progress on the one hand, and the slow time of Black rights on the other hand. In my current book project, Black Patients, Performance, Civil Rights, and the Refusal to Wait for Freedom, I argue that during the civil rights movement, the theatrical stage was a key site for renegotiating these vexed and paradigmatic relationships among Blackness, time, and the making of modernity. Joining William O. Walker, Jackie Robinson, and thousands of everyday people, Black theater workers were critical to Black people's global campaigns to alter the time of Blackness and of Black citizenship by demanding freedom now. So part two, a bit about the book. In Black Patients, I reconsider the civil rights movement from the perspective of Black theater. I argued that Black theatrical performance was a vital technology of civil rights activism and a crucial site of Black artistic and cultural production. During this historical moment, Black artists and activists turned to the covetous stages of Broadway. They produced plays in the Netherlands and performed in US prisons. They staged Waiting for Godot in the cotton fields of Mississippi, once dodging a bomb tossed from the audience to the stage. Analyzing a largely unexplored transnational archive of Black theater, this book charts a new cultural and political history of the civil rights movement. In situating theater at the heart of the civil rights movement, I argue that time was at the center of Black political world making, Black performance, and revolutionary Black thought in this post-war era of socio-political transformation. I demonstrate how Black theater workers like James Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry, Duke Ellington, Alice Childress, Amiri Baraka, Langston Hughes, and the Free Southern Theater used theater to frame the problem of anti-Blackness and white supremacy as a perpetual problem of time, and more specifically, to unsettle the colonial foundations of a modern world system and a historical phenomenon that I call Black patience. By this, I mean a large-scale racial project that weaponizes and coerces performances of patience among Black people as a way to invigorate and reinforce the global operations of anti-Blackness and white supremacy. Where patience has not been glossed over in analytic philosophy, it has often been explained away as a minor or secondary virtue, and thus regarded with less critical import than other more celebrated virtues like courage. As my book demonstrates, however, patience is a constitutive feature of Black life and has been since the onset of transatlantic slavery. And here I'm thinking about the network of spaces of containment like the barracoon, the slave castle, the slave pen, the belly of the slave ship, the auction block, all these places where we've been forced to be patient. But patience also remains vital to the relations of racial power that continue to structure the unfinished project of modernity, as we see with Eisenhower, or also even someone like Barack Obama, who right after his second term sort of urged Black people to maintain hope and to be patient, and said that change won't come overnight, right? On this front, the etymological origins and multiple definitions of the term patience are instructive, especially for the book's task of analyzing the cultural, political, and ontological dynamics that subtend the long history of what I'm calling Black patience. Derived from the Latin word patientia and the Latin verb pati, both of which mean to suffer, patience is, by definition, a performance of suffering. Considered in relation to those tortured grammars of suffering, that's a phrase I borrow from Frank Witterson, considering those torture grammars of suffering that have besieged Black life for more than 4 centuries, from slavery and Jim Crowism to lynching, mass incarceration, police brutality, and voter suppression, the sign of suffering requires a more careful accounting of the global history of Black suffering within our critical evaluations of patients. And so I want to close just by sort of talking a little bit about a couple of the examples that I use in the book to sort of make this argument. There are plays like Langston Hughes' Jericho, Jim Crow, a 1964 play that Hughes dedicated to all the people sitting in and staging other parts of the civil rights movement. He gave all the proceeds from the play to civil rights organizations. He didn't charge nonprofit organizations for producing this play. But in the play, there's a woman who's a character whose name is Old Woman, and she says, ever since slavery, they've been telling me, why don't you all be patient? And so going from there to in the first chapter, I think about the Emancipation Proclamation. It's now 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation during the centennial, and Black people and Black playwrights in particular are saying, well, it's been 100 years. We've been waiting for freedom. How much longer do we have to wait? And they say things like, we're still half slave, half free. Right. And so people like Duke Ellington and even Lorraine Hansberry, her 1950 play, A Raisin in the Sun, which is a play all about patience, right? The title is taken from a Langston Hughes poem that asks, what happens to a dream deferred? And so this 1963 Emancipation Proclamation Centennial really becomes an important moment for thinking about a century of Black patience. I also look at things like the Free Southern Theater, where actors and theater troupes are staging plays like Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. I also think about sort of how Black patience manipulates the future as a way to oppress Black people. So in other words, if you keep waiting, there's something in the future that will benefit you. And a part of what Black playwrights know is that those futures often don't come. And so I think about what that means for Black people in general, but also turn to people like Amiri Baraka to think about sort of queer futures and the limits of future-oriented discourses for Black queer people in particular. And finally, the last 2 things I'll say, there's a chapter that thinks about even as white people have historically asked for Black patience, they've been among the most impatient. And so Black playwrights like James Baldwin, and writing a play like Blues of Mr. Charlie, really taps into this idea of white impatience through things like temper and affect in the play, white people's dispositions, but also audiences who were impatient with Baldwin's representations of white people and also the long running time of the play. And finally, I end the book by thinking about a group of plays that show how Black people have actually turned patience on its head through things like the sit-in and the gel-in to defeat and destroy the thing that I am calling the racial project of Black patience. And so I'm happy to talk about other parts of the book and the work in the conversation with Dean Thorntondale.
Wow, Julius, thank you. You've given us a lot to think about. That is both historical and timely, and we didn't plan to have you the Friday after Election Day, but it is interesting that this is the time we get to have this conversation. So, but before I get to the present, let me just ask you a little bit about the past. You acknowledged your professor from Tougaloo College. And those of us who know something about Tougaloo, which is a historically Black college and university in Mississippi, and know that it was a space for various kinds of interracial gatherings and civil rights gatherings in a state and in a place where those things were very much limited. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you came upon this work, how you discovered the Free Southern Theater, for example, and its meanings in that context of Mississippi in the 60s. So a little bit more about you and why this project.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. So I was interested in writing a dissertation about literature and the civil rights movement, African-American literature and the civil rights movement. And so I was noticing that there's a kind of a large and increasing discourse on photography, television, and music during the civil rights movement, but not much about literature, especially when I was in graduate school. But then I was TAing at Princeton for Imani Perry, and there was a conference at Princeton, and at that conference was Bob Moses, who of course had been so influential in the Mississippi arm of the civil rights movement. And he mentioned the Free Southern Theater, this theater that was not only doing important social and political and cultural work in Mississippi, but was actually founded at Tougaloo College, the place where I did my undergraduate degree, and I had never heard of it. And so I was a little frustrated, like, why haven't I heard of this amazing theater? And so I, started to do the archival work. And as I did that work, and I went to places like the Rare Book Library at Emory, and I see Dr. Akiba Sullivan Harper here, who's also an important mentor. Emory and at Yale at the Beinecke and Tulane, also in places like Amsterdam. But I started to realize that, and in places like Township Theater in South Africa, that this was a kind of global effort to use theater as a way to intervene in and participate in the civil rights movement, but also in larger anti-colonial movements as well. And so things began to crystallize to the point where I realized that in a very self-conscious way, theater saw itself as important to the cultural and political arms of the civil rights movement.
Do you think that theater offered some forms of engagement for maybe other groups of people that were not engaged in some of the other ways? And what do you think that was?
Yeah, sure. So I think theater is it's an art of the people. And so in Mississippi, for example, many of those people didn't have televisions, and they often only had 8th grade educations. And so sometimes they couldn't read the kind of headlines in the newspaper that announced things like the Birmingham church bombings and, civil rights activists who were being attacked. And so theater, what the Free Southern Theater, for example, realizes that theater is an art of the people. You don't have to have a certain degree of literacy. You don't have to have access to certain technologies, but you can still assemble in the cotton field of Mississippi and to sort of understand what it's like to wait on something and it never arrives. And so they were worried that a high art modernist play like Waiting for Godot would go over these people's head. And it didn't. They understood it. And in fact, in one of these productions, Fannie Lou Hamer in the Mississippi Delta in Ruleville, she stood up and said, we are Vladimir and Estragon. We are the ones who have been waiting for far too long.
Mm-hmm. Say a little bit, for those who are not familiar with Waiting for Godot, a little bit about the nature of that play and what the message is, how it connects.
For sure. So of course, it's this, kind of absurdist play that is all about really pointless waiting. You're waiting for somebody who has promised to come in the same way that the US continues to promise freedom and emancipation. And the person never comes, but it's what a scholar whose name is Lauren Bland at the University of Chicago, she coins this term cool optimism. And a part of what she says is that the way in which power works is that it gives us the illusion of hope. Right. And she's interested in neoliberalism, right? But for Black people, it certainly predates that. But through this kind of deceptive use of hope and this deceptive belief that the future will be better, we return and return and return, right, to that scene of violence, even as we know it will lead to what Berlant calls slow death. So a part of what's important about Waiting for Godot is that it really opened up Black people's, particularly rural Mississippians' minds to thinking about how they can get out of this incessant cycle of waiting and to fashion a different world in which they don't have to wait so incessantly.
Okay, so you've said, you've given us a picture of, and you've talked about Black patients. And I think I want to get you to talk about that a little bit more, because I think it's a really interesting concept. And you've turned it on its head in a way, because certainly people of my generation, but others, learned patience is a virtue. And, and yet there obviously are these two kinds of messages taking place. And so I just, and you talk about it, really, Black patience is kind of a subversion of this virtue, and it becomes used as a tool of oppression. So can you say a little bit more about that? Break that down a little bit.
Sure. No, and I was also trained in that school of kind of Black patience. I said this on a call with my colleague Jess a couple of weeks ago. My grandmother used to have this, this saying, and I'm the oldest grandchild, and she would say to us, "If you're going to flip the world over, don't let them know until they're flipping." So it's all about this idea of waiting patiently and then moving into action just at the right time. And so, there's this tension, right? Black people have used patience toward productive ends. And so I end the book by thinking about something like the sit-in and the gel-in. And I think about that process of rehearsing for a sit-in and a gel-in. These people were in nonviolence trainings where they were slapped, they were burned with cigarettes, their hair was pulled. And so a part of that process, Dr. King put it this way, he said, how can you condition the body to take blows? And so they went through a lot to learn the art of patience because they knew the potential of Black patience, because Black people had known that for decades by that point. And so there's certainly kind of productive utility there with patience and Blackness. What I'm interested in is how sort of white supremacy and anti-Blackness mobilize patience or mobilize Black people's waiting as a way to shore up the power of white supremacy. And a part of it is certainly about time, right? It's about the temporal deception. It's about misleading people to think that the future will be better. But a part of what I also argue in theorizing Black patience is that as important is the kind of affective dimension of patience. So in other words, one can wait and not wait patiently, right? So there are moments from, in Booker T. Washington and all kinds of slave narratives where the slaves are reprimanded, of course, for not being patient or for being a little too sassy. Or for example, during the civil rights movement, a huge part of the conversation was people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X and Fannie Lou Hamer, they just didn't know how to behave, right? And so a key part of patience is about the affective disposition that one has while they wait, right? And a part of what white supremacy expects is a kind of Black passivity, not anger, not rage, right? Because when you exhibit and perform those affective responses, then you move outside of the category of patience.
Mm. Okay, I'm sure people will want to get into this a little more, but I want to just take a little bit of a turn because there are students on this, and I want to ask if you teach courses related to these topics and how your research informs your teaching.
Yeah, sure. So I teach a lot of Black performance courses. And I really like those courses because one thing that we know is that Black people have been sort of prevented from having access to certain forms of literacy, writing, certain kinds of knowledge. And I actually find it really powerful and fascinating, just the inventive ways Black people have been able to use the body, in motion, the body in performance, to create discourses, to enact modes of resistance, to offer up political critiques, right? In and through the body, so that the body itself is able to produce these embodied vocabularies. And so in my classes, I really invite students to think about how the Enlightenment really prioritized certain forms of knowledge and certain modes of knowledge, and particularly writing, and sort of ways in which we can work toward decolonizing the hierarchies of knowledge, or what one performance theorists call the apartheid of knowledges, right? And so in those classes, the students really do take the journey with me, so that we think about sort of how everything from the middle finger or the finger sign to Beyonce's Super Bowl performance where she's adorned in Black Power attire, right? Sartorial performances, to Barack Obama singing of Amazing Grace, how all of these modes of embodied performance sort of have political and social meanings.
So I'm going to stay on kind of the student side a little bit, but one of the things about this theme, the president's theme about Terrapin Strong, talks about identity. And I wonder how you think about your research informing notions of identity, and specifically how Black patience constructs identity. You've said a little bit about this, but how does it construct identity historically and for young people today?
So yeah, there's this idea in Lorraine Hansberry's 1959 play, A Raisin in the Sun. There's a moment where the brother Walter Lee tells his sister Benita, who wants to be a doctor, essentially, why don't you just wait and go off and be a nurse like all the other women? instead of these kind of lofty things of being a doctor. And so I think in those moments we see sort of how crucial, for example, time is and patience is to identity formation. So that when these people historically have been invested in Black patients, at stake is not only sort of constructions of Blackness or particular subjectivities that they would like to see sort of willed into being, but it's also about their own identities. So by forcing Black people to be patient, or by forcing women to be patient, or queer people to be patient and wait for the perfect time, they can better solidify their own sense of superiority and power. And so I think at stake in this racial project is identity itself and the kind of social hierarchies that we create to organize those identities in relation to each other.
Mm. Okay, I'm going to ask one other question before I open it to others. And that brings this to today, literally today. and kind of the performance of the request for, the demand for patience, the need for patience, and the and its role in kind of civil rights movement and actions today. I was reading a work by I'll remember his name in a minute, I'm going blank, but he talked about this period as a continuing same. You know, it's and so this tension between patience and struggle is very much before us. And I'm just wondering how you bring this into your thinking about where we're living right now and what we're struggling with right now.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the hardest parts of teaching undergraduates especially is sort of trying to balance being optimistic and hopeful, but also kind of being honest about what the archive says. And so, you know, I teach a lot of courses that run from sort of mid-19th century to the present. And part of what I have to demonstrate to students is how after every sort of big victory or Black victory or success, whether it's Reconstruction and then lynching and all other sorts of things, or the civil rights movement and then the kind of retrenchment of rights in the Supreme Court cases, you know, kind of attacking affirmative action, or whether it's, you know, our current president after Barack Obama, there is a pattern where all sort of forms of Black progress thus far in this nation have been followed by these huge setbacks and punishments for those modes of victory. So there's that historical reality that I know, but there's also a kind of deep sense of hope and optimism and record of change that I know for a fact. I'm from Mississippi, which is often considered ground zero of anti-Blackness and white supremacy. But also Robin D.G. Kelley, who is perhaps the leading theorist of Black radicalism, said that Jackson, Mississippi is the most radical place on earth. And a part of what I think he's getting at is that no matter how staunch of an environment of oppression Black people have found themselves in, there have always been these ways that they've enacted and created change, right? Even as they are being asked to be patient. So I think that knowing that heartens me, and it lets me know that even as the world will continue to demand Black patience, Black people will continue to be impatient. And I think a part of what we have to learn, especially in this really heightened political environment, is that some of that work of resisting Black patience will be vocal. It will be conspicuous. It will look like Black Lives Matter protests. It will look like faculty protesting, right? But other forms of that work might look like what Stacey Abrams was doing in Georgia quietly, right? Sort of really shifting the kind of political geography of that state without making a whole lot of noise. And so I think at the end of the day, what I say is that in order to combat this project of Black patience, we'll need all of our forms of activism to ultimately say to the world that Black people will not wait.
Wow, that's really profound, Julius, and very moving. Because when I think about what we're facing going forward, regardless of who is elected as president, but maybe even regardless of whom, there is more patience as suffering, struggle ahead. And I think one of the things that people have ignored oftentimes are the things that are going on kind of under the surface. That when the time opens up, when the space opens up, there is an opportunity for those things to be seen. And that's what I hear you talking about here.
Sure.
Okay, everybody can see I'm really very moved by this. And so I'm gonna kind of let others in at this point. So Linda, I'm gonna turn it to you to invite others to join the chat, and just thank you, Julius.
Thank you. This is fun.
Thank you. Thank you, Julius, so much. There are already a couple questions, so I'll just start with those. But while I ask them, I want to encourage everybody to go ahead and put in the chat your comments and questions. We may not get to all of them, but we will try. And then we will have a recording of this later. And I'm certain that Julius is open to having email and conversations later after this about his talk. So let me start with the first one that I got. Tell us about how Black patients on the modernist stage squared with the affect of African-American Christian patients for the Second Coming.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks for the question. So of course, if we think about that kind of discourse of through the lens of Christianity, right? Black people, especially in the 19th century, there was this kind of really thick discourse of we'll wait on the Lord. But one thing we discovered during the civil rights movement is that, you know, people are becoming, Black people that is, are becoming more and more secular. And this is happening in places like Mississippi, where people really are a part of church culture. But that idea that we'll wait on the Lord really starts to be shaken in a way that's quite unprecedented. And so really, there are a lot of Black people who are ministers, for example. And so a part of where this project comes from is my frustration, honestly, with a lot of scholars who are part of what is now called the long civil rights movement framework. And a part of what they argue is that, you know, these Black ministers in places like Mississippi and Alabama were somehow conservative, and that the real radical political work was mainly happening in the 1930s and among white communists, right? And so a part of what I think we miss is, you know, even though those men are in suits and women are in suits and they're wearing their Sunday's best and they're worshiping and praising the Lord, right? They also are saying, we will not wait. And their actions are saying that we will not wait. And so I think that this is a moment where we see that kind of Christian ideal of waiting on the Lord really challenged and expanded and put in the service of kind of Black political progress.
Thank you. The next comment question. I'm interested in the ways that waiting has been vilified as a form of Black deviance. I'm thinking about Jim Crow laws around loitering and Black folks not being able to physically assemble. Can you think of any other ways that Black patience has been used to fuel negative stereotypes about Black folks?
Yeah, I mean, there's the idea that Black people are lazy, Black people don't have ambition, they aren't go-getters, you know, with very little recognition of the structural impediments to their movement. And so, you know, still this idea of stillness is central to performance studies. And a part of what performance theorists argue is that the structure of the modern world in the wake of slavery has been set up in order to create the conditions and to curate environments in which Black bodies have to be still. And so that embodied performance and the movement of the body itself becomes a mode of resistance. And so I think you're right, stillness and kind of implacidness become technologies of violence. But also Black people have used stillness, as I show in that last chapter, they've used stillness in radical ways. So if we think about what it means for a Black sharecropper in 1963 Mississippi, who's working crazy hours and is basically subjected to this new form of slavery, right? And a new form of extraction of their labor, that they have dishes to wash, they have clothing to hang out on the line, they have children to feed, after they've worked until sundown, and yet they take time out, 2 hours out, to not only attend this play, to not only sit still in that cotton field, right, but to stay for the talk back, the post-production talk back, right? And so the ways in which Black people have also used stillness and time itself as a way to combat that Black patience is also important.
I think this next question is a bit related to what we've already mentioned in the last two, but let me throw it out there. Do you think that the teaching of patience as a virtue has been weaponized via the power of social norms, and in the South as an aspect of the ultimate cultural directive that rudeness is the cardinal cultural sin. So I think they're asking for you to, further expand on your idea of patience, that teaching patience as a virtue has become weaponized, and is it in contrast to rudeness as the cultural, and maybe you don't agree, maybe that's your response, is that rudeness is the cardinal cultural sin?
Yeah, I think that's right. There are things that I think Black people, we know with our guts, right? And that we've been trained. There are ways in which we've been trained to perform. And so I think many Black people across the world sort of get this mother wits knowledge, oh, when you're around these groups, this is how you have to behave, especially with, things like Black women. And also Black men, but Black women especially, having to carry that weight of always, and we've seen this with Kamala, right, where she's had to kind of tamper down the kind of attacks, or not attacks, but the kind of forceful lines of interrogation in which she would engage before she was the vice presidential candidate. So I think you're right that Black people are trained to be patient, knowing the consequences that often sort of emerge when they are, or when we aren't patient. And so one way in which I think about this in the book is when James Baldwin wrote Blues for Mr. Charlie, it was followed shortly by a kind of trio of Amiri Baraka's plays, and we know how quote unquote angry Amiri Baraka was. The white theater critics couldn't even talk about the content of the play for saying things like, oh, Mr. Baldwin has produced yet another angry play, or Mr. Baraka is really an angry man. And it's this fear not only of Black people being angry, but also of Black art being angry. So I think a part of what we have to ask is, what does white supremacy fear about Black anger? Or why does every time someone is murdered by police, right, a Black person is murdered by police, they seek out the family to say, everyone, please be peaceful, be patient, don't be angry, right? And we have to think about what is it that really is being kept at bay and keeping Black anger at bay.
Next question. Can you talk more about the Black success, white lash cycle? Is it possible to think of the cycle as pattern of white supremacy interrupted by Black success and return to the norm of white supremacy?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is there's a scholar who's actually a UMD English PhD alum, Caretha Mitchell. She writes a book about this. And she says that, Black people aren't lynched because they're, terrible or late. They're lynched because, white people fear their success, and they fear the potential that they will become citizens. So I think we have plenty of historical evidence to suggest that there is punishment and reproach for Black success. There will be backlashes for Black success.
And I think what we'd like to do after the questions and after this session, Ashley can email you and get maybe that author and other resources that you've mentioned as a list, and then we can send it to everybody who's registered for this session so they can have that list for future reference. Okay. Thank you for including Langston Hughes in your analysis. Have you looked at his 1961 poetry collection, Ask Your Mama, which uses the hesitation blues as a recurring musical theme?
Yeah. So at one point, Ask Your Mama, I had a chapter about Ask Your Mama in the dissertation that didn't make it to the book. It's a really fascinating and understudied piece, but Hughes also adapts it and makes a kind of a ballet out of it and all sorts of things. But a part of, I think, what's so innovative about what Hughes does, and just for some kind of historical context, Hughes was in some ways seen by the emerging Black arts and Black power people as too passive and too patient. Right. And so, he starts to produce this work in the 1960s that kind of says, hey, you all, I'm not that patient. I can also be radical. Sadly, he dies shortly thereafter. But I think what that shows is that Black artists themselves were using art to say to the world that Black people will no longer be patient. And I think theater is such an important genre and form for that work, because people can read novels in the comfort of their own homes and we really don't get a sense of their responses or audience reactions. But when you're in theater sitting shoulder to shoulder, there's almost this visceral reaction. You can sort of see real time how that work is affecting audiences. And there's so much in the archive about how these challenges to Black patience, actually you could see the shifts, right, among the audiences in the theater. And so Hughes was definitely a part of that generation of artists.
Okay, next question. I was smiling because people are throwing at you different names of things and you know them. You just right there, you know, all of the body of knowledge. It's great. Next question. How do you address the cultural specificities associated with Black patients across the diaspora? Obviously, anti-Blackness is a white supremacist pathology across the world, but I wonder how Black patients can be both capacious and specific. Here I am thinking about my work with Afro-Colombian communities. Thank you for your work.
Sure. I think that's a good point. So one thing I don't want to do is to kind of generalize and to come up with some grand theory about Black people across the diaspora and how they respond to Black patients or relate to Black patients, because those things are diverse, right? If we look at the work that Black playwrights and the theater worker Gibson Kente was doing in South Africa with Township Theater, is very similar to what was going on in Mississippi, right? And of course, there was this historical conversation between Mississippi and South Africa and what was going on with apartheid and Jim Crowism, but the work they're doing was very different because of the different historical conditions. I think what I'm interested, so I think I take the point, which is that we don't want to collapse Blackness. We want to respect and honor the intimacies, but also the intricacies and differences of diaspora. At the same time, a part of what I want to foreground is that despite the various places slavery dispersed Black people, there is a global world system in place. Whether you're in Trinidad or in Ghana or in Alabama, there has been a historical effort under this colonial enterprise to force Black people to wait. And it's the kind of global nature of that project that I'm interested in, but also the global form of critique of that project that I'm interested in, even as it's looked different in various geographies of the African diaspora.
Thank you. These questions are very diverse, which I think is really good. This is another maybe more specific one. Are there contemporary Black playwrights whose work you are following? How are they moving this conversation that you're capturing forward?
Yes, and I'm trying to think about whose work I really like Pharrell Allen McCraney's work. I really like Katori Hall's work. I mean, yeah, this is the thing about there's so much Black innovative cultural production writ large. And so if we look at what's happening on television, and we look at the novels by people like Kiese Layman, Jasmine Ward, work by Natasha Trethewey. I mean, this one good thing about when we're in that moment, we talked about the backlash that follows Black success. One good thing about the moments of the backlash, and we can think about the 1990s, for example, we got so much good literature, right? In these moments of kind of conspicuous compression, I think Black people are at their creative best. They're at their most innovative, right? Because a part of what I think happens is that they're in the trenches and they're struggling to find a way to get out of these enclosures of anti-Blackness and white supremacy. So their Black cultural production tends to really blossom in those moments. And if we look at a place like New York, for example, I think, last year before the coronavirus, of course, there were over 40 Black authored plays opening in the New York theater world. And that's hugely important.
Maybe again, when Ashley emails you later and you have time to think, I bet people would really love to hear from you a list of other playwrights to follow up on. Okay, my dissertation here was on passing, which is an active performance. Can you comment about this strategy, which is personal rather than movement based?
So I think what I'll say, so I might, push the idea that it's not movement based, right? Because I think passing is movement based, even as it's an individual performance. There are communities of passers, people. The one way in which people know how to pass is because someone came before them and passed and either did it successfully or not. So I think that even though it's an individual performance, it is community based. But I think, in terms of my teaching, I always teach Ella Larson's 1920s novel Passing, because a part of what it shows is just how really stupid the idea of racial classification is. It shows how skin says very little about who you are as a racial being, and really the ignorance of the people who came up with the system to be able to identify who's actually Black and who's not. And so I think that racial passing as a performance really shows sort of, or really unveils just the kind of slipperiness of race itself, and sort of how these categories, even as they seem so real, can be subverted easily.
So this next comment question is from Candace Jackson. So in this case, I want to make sure you know who it is when I say, first, happy belated birthday. I am so proud of you and this work. I'm interested in patience, or particularly the performance of patience as a revolutionary act. I'm also thinking about the politics of Black comedy and performance to discuss race and racism. Do you see any alignment between these two performative spaces?
Yes, yes. And Dr. Jackson, I think often about your work when I was in undergrad. You were doing on Hattie McDaniels and Going with the Wind. And, you know, as an undergrad, I would think, oh my Lord, how could this woman take this role and, you know, deal? And I've come to learn, you know, there are strategic ways of being patient to change the world. I think you're right about comedy. One thing that comedy, in other words, I would say, is one of the most salient aesthetic features of this body of civil rights drama that I'm interested in. And so a part of what these playwrights know is that if you write a play like Dutchman, like Amiri Baraka, you will get a very particular response. And so when they didn't go that route, there's a play called Fly Black Bird. I'm sure very few people have heard of it. But Fly Black Bird went on to win an Obie Award, which is the highest award you can get in New York for an off-Broadway production. Part of what white critics constantly said is that the message in Fly Black Bird is, quote, hard-hitting, but it is funny. And the play doesn't forget that its job is to entertain first. And so comedy became a way for Black playwrights, of course, to make these messages and resistances to Black patients palatable to white audiences. I mean, and I think it's important to note that so many members of the audience were white liberal theater goers, and they were some of the most angry, of course, at these portrayals of whiteness. And so comedy helped to temper the messages often.
We just have a couple more questions, and I think that's perfectly timed because we have about 5 minutes left. What are some observations or thoughts you have had on geographies, i.e. rural South versus metropolitan North, and their relationship to how time is experienced or felt?
Yeah, so this is something that's personal for me as a native Southerner. You know, of course, I'm so used to, oh, everything's so slow in Mississippi. Oh, you're just so slow. Everything's slow. And it's like I moved to Philadelphia, and I'm like, wow, these people must have come from Mississippi because they're quite slow. So I think there are all these like stereotypes about speed and geography and slowness. And one of them that's most interesting to me is the idea that somehow Black people in the South are complacent with Black patients. And that's just not true. And if you listen to, you know, when I listened to my grandmother, who was a sharecropper and who grew up in rural, an oppressive Jim Crow environment, if you hear the stories about how Black people in the South have been resisting white supremacy and anti-Blackness for over a century, you really will rethink some of these ideas about geography and radical Black political action. And I'll end this answer by saying that I think what's at stake for us as scholars in particular is a kind of necessary rethinking of our ideas about radicalism. And so radicalism is always a contextual problem for thought. And this is what I argue in the book. You know, these scholars who are dismissing the civil rights movement as somehow conservative or not radical enough, what is radical in Mississippi, a place where you can't walk on the sidewalk with a white person or live by a white person, is very different than what's radical in New York. So I think a part of what we have to do is to remember that radicalism is always contextual. And as Fred Moten says, at the end of the day, it's a critique of the proper. And wherever Black people are critiquing the proper, whether that's in Jasper, Texas, or New York, we have to understand them as important forms of radicalism.
Thank you. I'm going to ask just one last question and then turn it over to Bonnie again. We'll make sure that the chat comments, though, that are here will be shared with Julius. They're all being recorded as well. Last question is, sorry, I'm just missing, here it is. This doesn't address theater per se, but could you comment on the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture and how it represents time and space generally and time-space barriers specifically?
That's an easy question.
You have 1 minute.
I think I'll say two things. One is that there was really this sense that Black people should be happy that we had been gifted this museum. And so, you know, there's this expectation that's, okay, we've done this for you, you know, don't ask for too much more, which is really prevalent. The other thing I'll say is that we also have to realize the importance of turning to genres like theater to tell our own stories, because a part of what that is, that's a national story of our history. And if you go through that museum, you really will get a kind of colored, very colorful sense of the history of Black patients that doesn't always represent the atrocities and violences that Black people have faced. And so I think theater becomes one of those genres where we can sort of put our stories alongside the kind of sanctioned national stories told by places like the Smithsonian.
Thank you. Bonnie, I'll turn it back to you then for the last minute or two.
Well, thank you. Julius, this has been amazing. And to all of those of you who are listening, I don't think I oversold Julius by saying he was a rising star. He is certainly one of our stars, and we're really very pleased and proud to have him among our faculty. And also just to really have you kind of, it's kind of like troubling the waters, but really troubling our thinking, having us really kind of think about the roles, the roles that theater has played in our experience, the importance of it as a radical form of thinking, and also just understanding kind of Black action behavior throughout in civil rights movement and really throughout our history. This has been kind of a tour de force in many ways of Black history, and I really, really thank you for it. It reinforces, I mean, you know, I'm sitting in front of Frederick Douglass today. I've been sitting in front of Frederick Douglass since Wednesday. And I think that, Julius, you really bring that spirit to this conversation, and I really want to thank you for it. I want to thank everyone who's here. I want to thank you, Dr. Candace Jackson, for everything you did to help this young man along the way. It's really paid off, and you certainly should be proud. So we will get all of this information to Julius. I think, you know, we were beginning to get kind of a list here of, oh, books, and take his course if you're a student. If you're a faculty member and we're still online, you know, see if you can audit or observe, follow his work and his book, which will be out next fall. Is that correct? Which will be out next fall. We'll let you know when it's up for pre-sale on Amazon. So again, thank you all for being here today. This has been wonderful.
Thank you,
Julia. Take care.